to the 2016 presidential election. At least it feels that way tonight, with just a couple weeks till the anniversary of the most surprising election night in generations. Two campaign stories are dominating the headlines, each an opportunity to refight the battle, each a way for some to cast doubt on the outcome. All the familiar names are present, with a single question hanging over all of them and all of it. Who's not telling the truth here? Are players in the Trump campaign being less than honest about the role a campaign data outfit played in their effort to elect President Trump? Now that it's been relieved, it reached out to WikiLeaks in pursuit of Hillary Clinton's emails. And on the Democratic side, are former Clinton campaign chief John Podesta and former DNC head Debbie Wasserman Schultz being less than honest about their connection to the Russia dossier. Each told Senate investigators they did not know who funded the opposition research that led to it, when in fact their respective organizations did. We have new reporting on this tonight and on the WikiLeaks outreach, as well as a larger discussion of how both stories have given the two sides of campaign 2016 the fuel to drag it nearly to the end of 2017. William Faulkner was right. The past isn't dead. It isn't even past. It's where we begin tonight. We're going to take you through both stories, lay out the timelines, and tease out any inconsistencies so you can decide for yourselves what to make of them and who to believe. Now, you probably heard each story described using words and phrases like convoluted and tangled web. We're going to try to detangle them, starting with a beat-by-beat account of the relationship between the Trump campaign and the number-crunching operation that would eventually ask WikiLeaks about Hillary Clinton's missing emails. Our Justice correspondent Pamela Brown reports.
11 days after Trump's GOP nomination on July 18, 2016.
For the presidency of the United States.
And 2 days after this now infamous moment.
Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing.
Donald Trump's campaign made its first payment to controversial data firm Cambridge Analytica on July 29th. We're now learning that same month, according to the Wall Street Journal, another infamous moment occurred. Cambridge Analytica's CEO, Alexander Nix, reached out to WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, seeking access to Hillary Clinton-related emails. Also that same month, WikiLeaks began releasing hacked emails from the DNC.
We have more material related to the Hillary Clinton campaign.
Cambridge Analytica was founded by wealthy Republican donors Robert and Rebecca Mercer in 2014. They began backing Trump after the GOP primaries in June of 2016. That same month, Jared Kushner took over all data operations for the Trump campaign. Kushner said once his father-in-law won the GOP nomination, the campaign used both Cambridge Analytica and the RNC's voter data, saying, quote, "We kept both data operations going simultaneously and a lot shared between them. And by that, we could scale to a pretty good operation."
They had a team of Cambridge data scientists embedded in the Trump headquarters who were doing very sophisticated modeling work that helped to inform where the campaign was going to send Donald Trump.
In August 2016, Steve Bannon became CEO of the Trump campaign. Before that, he was the vice president of Cambridge Analytica. While working for the firm, Bannon had urged the Trump campaign to hire them as far back as April, according to The New Yorker. In September 2016, the Trump campaign made its biggest payment to Cambridge Analytica, $5 million. That's according to FEC filings. Those payments eventually totaled nearly $6 million. The payments listed by the FEC as being for data management services.
The firm has offices in London, New York, and right here in Washington, D.C., just 3 blocks away from the White House. CNN has reached out to Cambridge Analytica for a response in the wake of the revelations about WikiLeaks. But despite our repeated attempts, we have not heard back.
But in November, just before the election, Cambridge Analytica's CEO, Alexander Nix, did speak to CNN about his data operation and the newly reopened FBI investigation into, you guessed it, Hillary Clinton's emails.
Clearly, there are unknown knowns, such as what's recently happened in the case of the Democrats' candidate with the release of the reopening of the email inquiry. We can't predict that.
As far as the Trump campaign, it released a statement distancing itself from the firm, saying, quote, "We as a campaign made the choice to rely on the voter data of the Republican National Committee to help elect President Donald J. Trump. Any claims that voter data from any other source played a key role in the victory are false.
Pam, would this be of interest to investigators for collusion?
Sources I've spoken to say yes. They say that the idea that the data firm reached out to WikiLeaks alone does not mean a crime occurred at face value. But as one FBI official told me today, what it shows is an intent to go beyond normal proactive campaign tactics. And investigators would use this bit of information to see if there was any coordination, whether there was anyone from the Trump campaign who was intimately involved. As I said, the intent and mindset, and whether there was any sort of conspiracy. You include this piece of the puzzle with Roger Stone, an advisor to Trump during the campaign, telling The Hill he had an intermediary who connected him with Assange. He also was briefly in touch with a Russian intelligence officer online on social media under the guise of Goosefer 2.0. And then, according to the Wall Street Journal, there was an effort by an opposition research working for with people on the Trump campaign searching on the dark web for Russians who may have had Clinton's missing emails. So all of this would be taken into account, but we should note there have been no accusations of wrongdoing, Anderson.
All right, Pam Brown, thanks. Joining us now is Senator Richard Blumenthal, Democrat of Connecticut and a member of the Judiciary Committee. To you, Senator, what, if any, is the significance of Cambridge Analytica reaching out to WikiLeaks?
It is significant because it demonstrates evidence of potential collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russian interference. There's no question, according to the intelligence community, that there was Russian interference. The president has called the special counsel's investigation and the investigation of the Judiciary Committee into that meddling and Trump collusion, alleged collusion with it, as a hoax. But here we have more evidence of a pattern that has been established of collusion and perhaps of obstruction of justice.
The statement put out by the Trump campaign saying, basically distancing themselves from Cambridge Analytica, saying, look, any suggestion that it was, anything but RNC data, that's what we relied on most heavily. They didn't even mention Cambridge Analytica. Does that pass the smell test, given they're spending nearly $6 million?
Not in the least, because they have spent $6 million to hire Cambridge Analytica as a consultant, as an agent. In that capacity, it was reaching out to WikiLeaks, in fact, reaching down into the gutter, because remember, WikiLeaks' business model is to take information stolen often by foreign governments like the Russians and then publicize it without any regard to the harm done to men and women in uniform or others who are cooperating with us abroad. And Cambridge Analytica well knew that business model.
It's very possible, though, that this was just a coincidence. It's just a coincidence that candidate Trump, said in that press conference, Russia, if you're listening, if you got the 33,000 emails, we'd love to see him or we'll release him or whatever the actual words he said. 2 days later, they start paying Cambridge Analytica, and later that month, they make Analytica makes the outreach to WikiLeaks. That, when you put out a timeline, it maybe looks like it's all of a piece. It could be a coincidence. There's no evidence that President Trump or anyone else from the campaign said to Cambridge Analytica, reach out to WikiLeaks.
Point number one, it could be all coincidence, but it has to be coupled with other circumstantial evidence, like the Trump campaign welcoming the outreach from Rob Goldstone saying he had Russian sources of dirt on Hillary Clinton. And
Government sources, actually.
And Donald Trump Jr. saying, I love it. The meeting on June 9th, the Air Force One statement doctored by and edited by the President of the United States. There is a series of circumstantial evidence. No conclusion reached yet, but certainly a basis to investigate.
I want to turn to the Trump dossier story. I asked you if it passes the smell test, that the statement made by the Trump campaign. Does it pass the smell test to you that the head of the DNC, the head of the Clinton campaign, are now saying they had no idea money was going through this law firm to pay for this dossier? If they didn't know, who would have known?
Well, the lawyer working for them was the one who actually began paying for this opposition research.
But isn't that a little too cute? If you're paying millions of dollars to a law firm, you probably want to know and will know what the law firm. The reason you do it through a law firm is to have deniability, I assume.
Regardless of whether that claim passes the smell test or not, remember what the key distinction is. Here, the money was coming from the DNC, and it was going to opposition research. It was not supported by a foreign government, not by the Russians. That's the key distinction.
Isn't it possible, though, that Christopher Steele, who was getting information, possibly buying information from Russian sources who may have been duped by the Russian government or in collusion with the Russian government to give I mean, that's the argument a lot of Republicans are making. Russian government may have given disinformation about candidate Trump through Christopher Steele that was essentially being paid for ultimately by the Clinton campaign.
And it never really had an impact on the campaign, another key distinction. But if it doesn't pass the smell test and it's worthy of investigation, the special counsel, Robert Mueller, will look into it. And bottom line, the collusion alleged between the Trump campaign and Russian interference, as well as obstruction of justice, is under investigation. And if there are other similar actions, they should be investigated as well.
Senator Blumenthal, appreciate your time. Thank you very much. Staying on the subject of the dossier that we just spoke about, CNN's Manu Raju joins us now with more details on that. What are you learning about what Clinton's former campaign chief, John Podesta, told the Senate Intelligence Committee?
Yeah, that's right, Anderson. In September, behind closed doors, John Podesta actually met with the Senate Intelligence Committee investigators. And towards the end of an interview that focused a lot on, of course, his hacked emails, the question was posed to him whether or not the Clinton campaign had any sort of contractual relationship with Fusion GPS, the opposition research firm that did produce the Trump-Russia dossier, and he said he had no knowledge of it. Podesta saying, you know, I didn't know, I don't know if we have any relationship, nothing like that at all. And this is significant, Anderson, because this is the first time that we have learned someone this high up in the Clinton universe sitting down behind closed doors with investigators on Capitol Hill discussing their knowledge about the ties with Fusion GPS, ties with that dossier. And even though he was not sworn in to formally go under oath, you cannot lie to Congress in an investigation. So his testimony or his interview had to be truthful because otherwise Congress will look into this further.
Manu, I understand the one person who's claimed to know about this research is the attorney, Mark Elias, and he actually was at this hearing as John Podesta's lawyer. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. In fact, he was sitting right next to him. He was representing John Podesta, even though he knew at the time that that his firm had retained Fusion GPS as its client to research these allegations. And Podesta said he had no knowledge of it. Elias did not offer any information there at that interview that he was aware of this. But he was there, just to be clear, he was not a witness during this interview. He was just there serving his client. But he very well could come back as a witness now that we do know that the Clinton campaign and the DNC were helping fund this research. But Anderson, in the aftermath of us learning about this, Elias's firm put out a letter saying that their clients only knew that they had this arrangement with Fusion GPS only recently, suggesting last month. John Podesta did not know at that time.
What about former DNC Chairwoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz? What did she tell the Senate Intelligence Committee?
Yeah, Anderson, we're learning for the first time she did meet with the Senate Intelligence Committee earlier this month, and she made a similar case. She was asked directly about whether or not the DNC had these similar ties to Fusion GPS. She said she had no knowledge of that either. She said pretty clearly that she did not. First time we're learning that she even met with the investigators, let alone saying that there was no DNC connection. But I can tell you, Anderson, now that we do know there is some, there's a very good chance that she could come back for further questions, because at that point, that was not a big bulk of the interview, but it could be if investigators want to call her back for further questioning, Anderson.
All right, Manu Raju, appreciate that. Before the break, we laid out the two campaign stories, one from each side, that are driving the latest skirmish in the election campaign that seemingly will not end. The Trump campaign's connection to Cambridge Analytica, which CNN and the Daily Beast reported had reached out to WikiLeaks in pursuit of Hillary Clinton's emails. And on the Democratic side, former campaign chairman John Podesta and former DNC chief Debbie Wasserman Schultz denying knowledge of paying the firm behind the Trump dossier. Joining us now is Brian Fallon, press secretary for the Clinton campaign and now a CNN political commentator. Also with us, CNN chief legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin and Trump supporter Ed Martin. So, Brian, I know you said you did not know about these payments. If John Podesta didn't know and Debbie Wasserman Schultz didn't know, who possibly would have known within the DNC and the Clinton campaign, because millions of dollars being given to a law firm?
Well, yes, but millions of dollars were given to a law firm to perform everyday legal work. I mean, the Perkins Coie firm would do things like our FEC compliance and internal vetting of people that would come on board the campaign.
They weren't asked to do opposition research?
Well, they were, I guess. But the point is that I see people going around saying that there were millions of dollars spent on this. Those are line items from these FEC reports that capture all of what Perkins Coie.
Right, but if millions of dollars are being spent and this firm is doing opposition research, someone's got to be saying, hey, what's the opposition research? Where is it? And how is it being, how are we getting this?
Right, and I don't know who was part of those conversations in April when the research firm Fusion GPS came to Mark Elias apparently and said, hey, a Republican had been funding this work up till now. We think you might be interested in it. I'm not sure who was part of that conversation at that time that gave the green light and said, let's
somebody in the DNC or the
yes, clearly
had to know.
And whoever that person is, I would shake their hand and offer to take them out to a steak dinner. I mean, I think that this was perfectly fine that this happened. I'm glad that somebody was taking ownership of making sure that we were trying our best to get to the bottom of Donald Trump's web of opaque business connections.
Ed, I mean, it's sort of the Colonel Klink defense of Jose Heroes. I see nothing, I don't know anything, you know.
Yeah, but it doesn't pass the smell test. I mean, you know, Anderson, I worked for Phyllis Schlafly, and one of the things the late Phyllis Schlafly used to say was one of the best things that happens to her was run for office and lose, because you learn how campaigns work. I did too. In campaigns, opposition research, especially of the kind that's was being sought, is not something that's not on the radar screen of the top level people. So maybe Podesta didn't know, maybe Wasserman Schultz, somebody knew, somebody had to know. You don't spend that kind of money without the word coming back on what you've got, frankly, because if you've got nothing, you stop spending it. So it doesn't make any sense. And by the way, it's been sort of covered up for months now. If it was such a straightforward issue, why not come out and say, here's what
that is the other issue. I mean, if it is, as you said, a great idea, why not?
When the dossier came out in January, I said at the time, I had never heard of Fusion GPS prior to after the election, and never heard of Christopher Steele, and never seen the dossier. That was all true. If I had known at that point that we had paid for it, that was the work product of research that the campaign had sponsored, I would have been happy to admit to it, because there's no shame in this. This is, as you just mentioned, campaign opposition research is campaign work 101.
Can I just draw a distinction here? As I understand it, GPS did a lot of work, not just the dossier for the Clinton campaign. The dossier, the last date on the dossier is December of 2016, a month after the election. You know, everyone in the Clinton campaign at that point was curled up in a fetal position on the sofa. I mean, they were not involved in doing that. So I think
at that point, it might have been the FBI.
Well, it's not clear like who was funding or why they were doing the research at that time, but it's not surprising that Brian and all of his colleagues didn't know what was going on in December. I don't think they were too involved.
No, but before there was a dossier, there were memos being written by Christopher Steele that were circulating somewhere, whether to the attorney or someone else. I mean, it wasn't as if they were.
Let me jump in here. It is definitely true during the months of the fall, September and October, that I was aware and other members of the campaign were aware of many of the rumors that were circulating about Donald Trump and meetings that, say, Carter Page, who was a foreign policy advisor to the campaign, may have taken in Europe. This was all swirling out there. We had multiple conversations about it, largely based on reporters calling us up saying, have you heard this? We're trying to run this down. Now, connecting the dots, I suspect that it was Fusion GPS that was briefing those reporters, which in turn was calling us. But we were familiar with this information. There are a multitude of Democratic organizations on the outside, whether it's Priorities USA, which is an entity I happen to work for now, or American Bridge, any number of which, you know, if you very well may have thought was helping seed these stories and tipping off these reporters that were then calling us.
But if Christopher Steele and Fusion GPS are briefing reporters, certainly they're giving memos to the lawyer who's paying them all this money.
Someone knows. And by the way, the point here now is that Steele, at least before this moment, Steele was talked about as someone who was getting information from the Russians. This is all a Russia push, right? So now we have to find out who in the campaign knew or should have known, and were they actively being told by Steele, hey, I've got sources in Russia that are pushing the story.
I don't see how Steele could have been paid by the Russians. Steele was investigating the Russians.
No, Steele was over. My understanding is the allegation was he was paying sources in Russia, and the Russian government, ostensibly, this is what we're hearing, were feeding stories and pushing things in.
I mean, Steele was hired because of his expertise in Russia. He wasn't able to go to Russia, but he still had contacts, we assume, with connections to the Kremlin or knowledge of, which is why some of the information in the dossier has turned out to be true. Other, information has not been verified and seems pretty outlandish.
Right, but
the allegation is that is it possible that the Kremlin was giving disinformation, negative information about candidate Trump to Steele that he's paying for, and that essentially, ultimately, the DNC...
Well, in that case, he'd be the victim of a wild goose chase. On the other hand, you have a set of actions that we know that the Russian government undertook, illegal acts that they committed in service or in furtherance of trying to help elect Donald Trump. There were no actions taken by the Russian government that helped Hillary Clinton. All we know that the Russian government did...
We just said there were maybe there were some.
What was the
Russians were feeding to...
They were feeding
to
information to a dossier that would come out after the election, after Hillary Clinton had lost.
Obviously, you already said Steele was talking to reporters, trying to put... You know how opposition works. You get something...
We don't know this. There's no evidence of this, but...
But if everyone's denying it, when people are lying, they're usually lying, as Trump said today, it's like Watergate in modern times. There's a cover-up of some kind. What is it? Now let's get to the bottom of it.
If the Russians were actually trying to collude with Hillary Clinton, not with Donald Trump,
right?
Query why they were hacking John Podesta's emails, hacking the DNC, leaking them all out, trying to hack into election rolls in certain states, but then leaving all this to Christopher Steele to carry out, not ensuring that any of the stuff about Donald Trump got out.
Let's get to the bottom of it. Let's get to the bottom of why no one in the campaign says they knew, and whether they knew that they were getting information from Russians. And let's get to the bottom of it all. Why not?
Jeff, the fact that no one in the campaign seems to have any idea about this, does that raise...
Well, someone has to have an idea. I mean, we've only heard from John Podesta and Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who was completely on the outside and had nothing to do with anything. I mean, Robbie Mook is the person you would certainly want to ask, who was the campaign manager, who was the person who was actually running the campaign. He would certainly know if the campaign was spending this kind of money. John Podesta was out raising money. He was not involved in day-to-day. Someone has to know. And the problem that the Clinton campaign has here, I mean, I think Brian, alluded to it, which is they would admit to it. I mean, they would say, look, this is what we do. Campaigns do opposition research. This is how we did it. There's nothing to feel guilty about. But the problem is they haven't said what the story really is.
All right.
Well, there's just a fundamental difference between the two stories that, CNN is giving proper attention to both stories, but they're characteristically different. Here, even when we find out the whodunit of who approved it in April of 2016, it still won't amount to much because there's no illegal activity afoot here. On the other hand, you have Cambridge Analytica admitting to reaching out to Julian Assange for the purpose of trying to obtain illegally hacked emails from Hillary Clinton.
That's not the campaign, right? We agree on that because a consultant, just like the law firm, just like the defense today was that that's a law firm.
The point is that you have a contractor hired by the campaign, in this instance,
with a beat-by-beat account of the relationship between the Trump campaign and the number-crunching operation that would eventually ask WikiLeaks about Hillary Clinton's missing emails. Our Justice correspondent Pamela Brown reports.
11 days after Trump's GOP nomination on July 18, 2016.
For the presidency of the United States.
And 2 days after this now infamous moment.
Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing.
Donald Trump's campaign made its first payment to controversial data firm Cambridge Analytica on July 29th. We're now the Trump campaign. Kushner said once his father-in-law won the GOP nomination, the campaign used both Cambridge Analytica and the RNC's voter data, saying, quote, "We kept both data operations going simultaneously and a lot shared between them. And by that, we could scale to a pretty good operation."
They had a team of Cambridge data scientists embedded in the Trump headquarters who were doing very sophisticated modeling work that helped to inform where the campaign was going to send Donald Trump.
In August 2016, Steve Bannon became CEO of the Trump campaign. Before that, he was the vice president of Cambridge Analytica. While working for the firm,
connection to the Russia dossier. Each told Senate investigators they did not know who funded the opposition research that led to it, when in fact their respective organizations did. We have new reporting on this tonight and on the WikiLeaks outreach, as well as a larger discussion of how both stories have given the two sides of campaign 2016 the fuel to drag it nearly to the end of 2017. William Faulkner was right. The past isn't dead. It isn't even past. It's where we begin tonight. We're going to take you through both stories, lay out the timelines, and tease out any inconsistencies so you can decide for yourselves what to make of them and who to believe. Now, you probably heard each story described using words and phrases like convoluted and tangled web. We're going to try to detangle them. Start to the 2016 presidential election. At least it feels that way tonight, with just a couple weeks till the anniversary of the most surprising election night in generations. Two campaign stories are dominating the headlines, each an opportunity to refight the battle, each a way for some to cast doubt on the outcome. All the familiar names are present, with a single question hanging over all of them, and all of it: who's not telling the truth here? Are players in the Trump campaign being less than honest about the role a campaign data outfit played in their effort to elect President Trump, now that it's been relieved it reached out to WikiLeaks in pursuit of Hillary Clinton's emails? And on the Democratic side, are former Clinton campaign chief John Podesta and former DNC head Debbie Wasserman Schultz being less than honest about their
learning that same month, according to the Wall Street Journal, another infamous moment occurred. Cambridge Analytica CEO Alexander Nix reached out to WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, seeking access to Hillary Clinton-related emails. Also that same month, WikiLeaks began releasing hacked emails from the DNC.
We have more material related to the Hillary Clinton campaign.
Cambridge Analytica was founded by wealthy Republican donors Robert and Rebecca Mercer in 2014. They began backing Trump after the GOP primaries in June of 2016. That same month, Jared Kushner took over all data operations for